And I'm grateful to all of you for dedicating your time today to showing up and supporting this holy community of practice.
Sam,
Yeah,
I'm so sorry, but I need to interrupt you for 1 second.
no problem.
Because there's been a spontaneous sponsorship of today's sit in honor of you. So Rivka is sponsoring today's sit when they learned that you were you're teaching rather. So Rivka, thank you so much. That is really a beautiful gesture. And so there.
And thanks, Rivka. And all
Okay, sorry to interrupt, Sam.
No, it's such a delight to know that Rivka's here and that Rivka's supporting these sits. And I just want to welcome you here in the fullness of your being and remind you that you have everything that you need to find a way into practice. We're about to enter my favorite part of the Torah, the Mishkan narratives, the instructions for building the tabernacle, and the description of how Moses and the artisans that he collected and collaborated with built the actual tabernacle in the wilderness. And it's amazing, I only realized this a number of years ago, even though I've been reading the Torah since I was a kid, every Shabbat and many times beyond that, that these narratives take up roughly the entire second half of the book of Exodus, right? So that should make you pause. There's something important going on here, right? And for those of us who may have read these parts of the Torah, we can get a little bit bogged down in the details. The planks should be this, length and width, and so on and so forth, and the hinges should be made out of this particular metal, and should be such and such, and so in their design, and so on and so forth. So we can get very much lost in detail. And though the details are absolutely important, because without that kind of specificity and clarity, one can't build a structure, not even a mundane structure, let alone a sacred structure that is meant to house the divine here on earth. But I want to focus today on the big picture, right? What is the Mishkan all about? What is the tabernacle all about? And why is it relevant to us here and now? And to help us with that, I'd like to invite Jordan to please put up the screen share and also drop the link to today's text sheet in the chat so that all of you can see it. But before we actually take a look at the text, I want to invite us to sing just for a moment. This is actually originally a Christian hymn that's been kind of Judaized by adding the last couple lines, but actually the sensibility comes directly out of the Hasidic tradition and the sources we're going to be looking at in a couple minutes. And not only that, but the simple or plain meaning of the text itself in the book of Exodus. So some of you may be familiar with this chant, and if you'd like to sing along, you're welcome. I'm sorry we can't unmute ourselves and sing together, and hopefully someday soon we'll be able to do that in person. Oh Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, and in thanksgiving I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Now the Hebrew, ve'asui mikdash ve'shachanti betocham v'anachnu nevarech Yam me'ata ve'ad olam. So those last two lines in the Hebrew come directly out of the scriptures. The first is actually from the opening of this week's Torah portion. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. This is where the divine turns to Moses and says, tell the Israelites to make me a sanctuary, a shrine. V'shachanti betocham, and I will dwell not in it, but in them, within the people. And I want to turn now to the Hasidic texts that we're going to be looking at in just a moment. So we have those here on the screen, and you can take a look at them privately, and you have them for your reference in the future as well by following that link. This is from Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sudilkov, who was the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, and literally grew up on his knee in his home until the age of 12. And here's what he has to say. Behold, the Torah is eternal. Of course, feel free to follow along in the Hebrew. Behold, the Torah is eternal, and we can construct a Mishkan for the Holy and Blessed One in our heart in every age and time through Torah and mitzvot, which is to say our spiritual practices. As is written, they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. The text doesn't say in it, but in them. So, one of the tenets of our tradition is that the Torah is eternal. And if it's eternal, it needs to be able to speak to me here and now in my life, in the context of the society in which I live and the challenges that I encounter as a human being in this particular age, in this particular embodiment. And that's exactly what he's saying here. And there's a problem because we study these ancient texts about constructing the tabernacle, and we don't have a tabernacle now, right? So why is it relevant to us? And he says it's relevant because it's teaching us that actually, if we practice, there's a possibility that we can become the sanctuary. Each of us can become a mishkan, the sanctuary for the divine here and now. He goes on to provide another proof text, right? The Torah also states God pitched a tent in us human beings from the Psalms. And we might encounter such a teaching and say, yes, but how, right? I'm not going to speak for you, actually. Maybe, you're not interested in kind of becoming a sanctuary for the divine presence. But one way we can understand Jewish mindfulness practice really is that it's about helping us to carve out an inner sanctuary for the divine presence to become more fully manifest in us, through us, and in our lives as consciousness, as love, as compassion, as connection. If that's something that speaks to you, you might say, yes, but how? And so I want to turn to a text here by Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezerich, the Maggid of Mezerich, who was responsible for turning Hasidism into a popular movement that swept half of Eastern European Jewry within a couple of generations. He was a direct student of the Baal Shem Tov. And thank God I've been blessed to be inducted into these practices through a direct line of transmission, going back to the Baal Shem Tov from teacher to student. And I'm happy to share this teaching with you now as well. And he's commenting on Genesis 2:1, right? That says the heaven and the earth were finished in all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that God had been doing. And God ceased on the seventh day from all the work God had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation that God had done. And the rabbis read this verse and they say, there's something that seems a little bit problematic here. Because in that last clause, because on the Sabbath, God ceased from all the work of creation that God had done, it seems like, if you read it at face value, that God made something on the Sabbath. And the Midrash comments on that, and here's what it says. Shabbat arrived and rest came into the world. Shabbat arrived and rest came into the world. You can see that in the block of text just below, right? Which is to say, the only thing that God created on Shabbat was rest. It was the only thing that the world was lacking. Throughout the week, when God was creating, there was activity, movement, generativity, creativity, right? Bringing the potential into the actual. And there was one thing missing from the world that hadn't been created, and that's rest. And that's what God created, as it were, on Shabbat. Shabbat arrived and rest came into the world. The creation of Shabbat itself, right, was the conduit for allowing rest to manifest as part of creation. And here's what the Maggid of Mezrich says on this. He says that the Midrash means to say that the power of the mover came into what is being moved. The mover is God, the divine source, or Ein Sof in our tradition, right? That which is infinite, without limit. And that the power of the source came into what was being moved, which is to say, the phenomenal world, right? Because everything in the world, in the phenomenal world that we know, it's characterized by movement, right? I challenge you to find one thing in this world that isn't changing, that isn't moving, that isn't turning around, that isn't arising and then passing away. Everything's moving. Look around the room right now and you'll notice, right? Everything here is changing. Everything. It might be changing very slowly, right? But it's always changing. And everything inside of us, it's always changing. And yet, says the Maggid, right, some aspect of God's essence was injected into all of that movement. He goes on to say the Blessed One is called rest. This is according to the Kabbalistic tradition. It calls God menucha, rest, rest. For something that is moving or changing or impermanent, right, has no rest. But movement does not pertain to Ein Sof, the limitless one. Right? Because to be limitless means, by its very definition, right, that there can't be any possibility for a beginning, change, and an ending, because those processes are part and parcel of movement. They're part and parcel of change. They're part and parcel of finitude. So are you with me so far, right? The idea is God is called rest because God is never changing. There's no movement within divine source or essence, right? This is why God is called rest. So we can take down the screen share, and I'll say real quickly here, just in a couple of quick sentences, to make this simple and straightforward for us, that God, that the teacher here is saying, the Maggid is saying, beneath all of the change, all of the movement, all of the impermanence, right? All of the moving circumstances of our lives and of the world, right? Underneath all of that, behind the facade of all of that, there is pure divine essence. And that pure divine essence is unchanging, unaffected in any way by all the movement, by all the change. So how do we construct an Mishkan, a place where the divine can manifest in us, right? His response is, look at what's always changing, then peel away the outer layers, and beneath it, you'll find essence. And essence is inherently peaceful, inherently still. And once you find that part of yourself, you will have encountered the divine presence. You will have domesticated, as it were, the divine presence. You will have internalized the divine presence within your own embodied finite being here and now. You will have touched the infinite from within or from out of, right, the finite existence of being an embodied being with a finite body and a finite mind and a finite and ever-changing world. So I want to follow the instruction point here as it was given to me by my teacher, Rabbi Miles Krasen, and invite us to sit in meditation for about 10 minutes. And the invitation is to look at what's always changing and then look to what's never changing. Look to what's always changing and then look to what's never changing. And in so doing, you will have discovered the union of spirit in matter and matter within spirit. So let's settle in. We can take some deep cleansing breaths all the way down into the belly, filling up all the way up to the rib cage and the collarbones, and then releasing in opposite order from the collarbones into the rib cage, into the belly, emptying completely. Let's take a couple of deep breaths like that and oxygenate the blood, become aware that we're breathing in the present moment, gathering in our attention into this moment on each in-breath and centering and grounding a little bit more in a relaxed way into the body on the out-breath. The eyes can be open or closed, whichever feels nourishing and safe for you. If the eyes are open, allow yourself to keep a soft gaze. Without focusing on anything in particular. The eyes can be downcast. And then choose an anchor. That anchor could be the rising and falling of your breath. It could also be the movement of sound as it makes contact with your ears, changes, passes away. Or it could be contact between your body and itself. For example, the feeling of your hands resting upon one another or upon your lap. Choose an anchor that feels like a good, safe, regulating home base. And then just watch the movement. Watch the movement. Observe, change, movement, movement. At some point, the mind will get caught in habit, get pulled off course. There's no problem. Notice how anything that's moving through the mind, whether it's a thought, an image, an impulse, that too is impermanent. See if you can observe it. Watch it arise, move, pass away. All we're doing is watching, observing, non-judgmentally, like scientists of our own minds and bodies, to see if we can find anything permanent, or if in fact everything is changing, moving, and as such finite. We can continue to observe our anchor in this way, grounding in the present moment, one moment at a time, noticing change, movement, arising, moving, passing away. And simultaneously, the invitation now is to become aware that all of that movement is happening in some sort of an open space. And it's not just an open space, it's an open knowing space. So be aware of your anchor and simultaneously become aware of the open, knowing space in which the movement is happening. Even as we hold our anchor and our attention, we can allow the anchor to kind of fall into the backdrop and for this knowing space to become the foreground. Which is to say, give your attention to the knowing space, even as your anchor moves and changes and is there in the background of your consciousness. And begin to investigate as you do so. The anchor is changing, isn't it? But is this knowing space changing? For example, when a breath arises, is the knowing space already there to greet it? Does the knowing space remain even as the breath changes? And what happens when the breath passes away? Does the knowing space dissolve? Or does it remain constant? And is it already there to greet the next breath? Simply notice what you notice, feel what you feel. Everything that's moving, everything that's changing is inherently unreliable. If we try to build our sense of well-being and happiness upon these impermanent phenomena, we're bound to be disappointed because it's like building a house on a deck of cards. The foundation will collapse in time. But right here and now, we can construct a Mishkan, not in spite of the body and mind, but through the finite body and mind, we can come to know that part of us that is presence itself, that is boundless, formless, pure divinity or pure spirit. That's been with us all along, but hidden behind layers of obscuration and conditioning. Perhaps as we recognize this part of ourselves with greater clarity and consistency and learn how to rest and be in this place more often, we'll discover that the very joy and peace we've been seeking outside of ourselves have been here at the core of our being all along. Let's conclude with that chant, and then we'll invite those in mourning to recite Mourner's Kaddish. And even as we chant, just notice, does that knowing space dissolve or disappear? Does it become divided in any way? Or does it remain unchanging, luminous, clear, spacious? Oh Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, and in thanksgiving I'll be a living sanctuary for. I'd like to invite those who are mourning or reciting Kaddish to place the names of their loved ones or the people for whom they're reciting Kaddish in the chat. That's an invitation, not an expectation. And I want to invite you to rise with me in body or in spirit as we recount their memories, take inspiration from their lives, and pray for a better, more human world. God's presence is fully manifest. Yitkadal, Yitkadash,
Yitgadal, Yitkadash, Rabba, Almighty Vate, Kirte, Vachte, Vachon,
Bachhe de Kodesh Canal, Amen. Me Abba Mizrach Lamach Almaya, Barach Bishtabach,
Shalom Bimroma, Kuya Aseh Shalom, Aleinu V'Yoko Yisrael Bimru.
Ishmael, V'Yakol Yosvei Bel, V'Yakol Ha'olamim, V'Yimru. Amen.
May the memories of those past be a source of blessing in our lives and inspire us to acts of loving kindness, compassion, and justice. Let us say Amen. Said, if you're leaving, we want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom, but if you'd like to stay on for some Q&R questions, and we'll be here until about a quarter after the hour.
Sam, thank you for that beautiful teaching and practice in creating the beginnings of our own Mishkan. Oh wait, I have to look at chat. I'm still a little in my sit. So if you have questions for Sam, please put them in the chat. And I mean, Sam, there might be something you want to add, or I could ask a question that I have. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions, but at the end, while we were sitting, you mentioned, the knowing space that sort of watches the movement, like of our anchor, our breath. And is that knowing space is really, am I understanding correctly? Like, it feels for me like that is my inner Mishkan, right? Like that's the container for the holiness, is this knowing space that is created through. Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah. So, if we look to the Mishkan itself, it's a physical structure, a finite structure that is designed to be collapsible and portable. And when it is erected, the divine presence then, as it were, enters into it and fills it. And infuses it with holiness. And we might have this tendency to say that, spirit takes up residence in the physical structure, but that the physical structure itself is not filled or animated with spirit, and that's a kind of dualistic view. And that's actually not the tradition in which I'm teaching. Some people are dualists and believe that there's a split between spirit and matter that can never be bridged.
Mhm.
Right? Actually not our tradition, the neo-Hasidic tradition and the original Hasidic tradition, right, are non-dual traditions. And so what I would say instead is that what we may come to discover through a practice like this, and there are many, many other practices that can help us recognize our deep nature, but one thing we may come to realize through this practice is that the knowing space in which everything arises is never separate from, or actually different from, the objects, the finite objects that are arising within it, right? So, for example, right?
Yeah.
Let's say right now you're aware of my voice. How many people here are aware of my voice as a finite object? It's a finite object, right? It arises, lasts for a while, passes. There's gaps, modulation, beginning, middle, ending. You're aware I am speaking, and then the next moment you're aware that I'm not speaking, right? So is awareness present while the speaking is happening? If it is, give me thumbs up. Is awareness present when the speaking ends? If it is, give me thumbs up. And then when I begin to speak again, is awareness present? And then when I stop speaking again, does awareness dissolve, or is it still present? Okay. Now I'm going to invite you to try a slightly different practice, but built on that foundation. While I'm speaking, right, and you're aware of the finite activity of my voice and its vibration making contact with your eardrum and registering as sound, and then there's a mental overlay of all kinds of constructs, right? Like, oh, that's Sam Feinsmith's voice and not, Firkins Reed's voice, and it's a pleasing voice, or it's not a pleasing voice, or it's a neutral voice, or it's a boring voice, or man, I'd like more of that, or man, I'd like less of that, whatever it is, right? Those are all mental constructs that we overlay on top of the raw sensory experience of sound coming in and being known, right? But as I'm speaking now, and you're aware that I'm speaking, the awareness of that speaking is arising in this knowing, cognizant space of awareness. Is that cognizant space in any way, shape, or form separate from my voice? Or are they one and the same, actually? Are they, we might say, co-arising, right? Or interdependent? If your experience is that the voice and the knowing space are actually never separate from one another, give me thumbs up. Okay. At first, that may be a subtle insight, and we may not have access to it. It might feel like, well, there's all this finite stuff over here, right? And then inside of me, there's this knowing space, but they're actually qualitatively different and separate from one another. But with ongoing practice and careful observation of the relationship between the finite phenomena that are known and the knowing space in which the knowing happens, in which those finite objects are moving, right, are actually an expression of the same reality. An expression of the same reality, indivisible from one another. It's just that the finite objects are a grosser or coarser version of the knowing space, which is subtle. but they're actually both made of the same stuff, which is consciousness. Now, I just want to say that that may be very hard to swallow, because the entire milieu in which all of us were shaped, right, believes that actually consciousness is an accident and everything is matter. Okay, that's the view of materialist science. Everything is matter. There's nothing but matter. And consciousness is an accident of the complexity of matter within the human brain, right? The spiritual view is actually, no, everything is spirit or consciousness, right? And matter is the illusion. Because matter is just a coarse form of spirit, okay? And it's nice to talk about these as abstract ideas, but if one were to take on a practice of continuing to observe the nature of that knowing space, which I call spirit, or pure consciousness, or pure awareness, or loving awareness, right? Or awake awareness. We can call it by whatever name we want, but it actually transcends language and names. But if one were to continue in that practice for days, months, years, right, and kind of stabilize their recognition, the awareness of the relationship between that knowing space and the finite objects within it becomes clearer and clearer and subtler. And at some point, we may find ourselves actually living the Baal Shem Tov's teaching that there's that everything is God and there's nothing but God, which is to say there's a singular reality, and that reality is pure, loving, undivided, indivisible, right? Spirit. So that's my response to your question, Frickens. And even with that awareness, it doesn't obliterate or obviate our capacity or hinder or in any way handicap our capacity to be in the world as finite beings, right? Acting out our roles and our personas and doing the finite things that we need to do, like thinking and going to the grocery store and making the call to the utility company so you can pay your bill. It doesn't preclude us from being able to do all those things, right? But the illusion of me in here as the separate doer who's trying to control everything out there to get what I want or to make my life more comfortable or to avoid suffering, that falls away.
Right. Well, that place of paradox is always the true space. Sam, so many people have questions.
Great. Okay, I'm glad.
They do. People are also, I think your name is Play. Sorry, I'm going backwards. But I think a lot of people are responding to your question with resources for you about the Jewish roots of what that Sam is teaching. Okay, let me find the questions. Let's see.
Yeah, Chantal, by the way, that book, Everything is God is a really, really, really good treatment of the subject that is not only abstract, but provides practices.
Yeah, and Play, I also suggested you email Sam.
Yeah.
I hope that's okay, Sam. Sorry, I've lost all these questions. There's so many. Okay, here's one from Laura. As God is limitless with no beginning and no end, how would you articulate the connection between God and the individuals who came before us and will come after us?
Yeah. There's such a beautiful midrash that I love so much. And for a while, I had it pasted over here on my windowsill before I did some tidying, but I still know it. It asks the question of how can the divine, which is infinite, be localized within a single structure, i.e. the Mishkan or the temple, right, later in Jerusalem. And here's the allegory that it provides. And by the way, this also might address Play's question. About the Tibetan tradition and, are there Jewish roots of the same kind of non-dual teachings that we find within the Tibetan tradition? So here's the answer the Midrash gives. It says, think about this image, right? Imagine there's a cave by the ocean. And the cave is completely filled with seawater from the ocean. but the ocean is never diminished, not even one drop, as it fills the cave. Right? So what our mystical tradition is teaching is that really there's only a singular consciousness, a singular reality, right? An infinite singular reality. Not my consciousness, not your consciousness, but a singular infinite reality, which we call Yod He Vav He in our tradition, right? Pure beingness, right? And that flows into each of our finite minds, but itself is never reduced. Which is to say that every sentient being on this planet, who ever was, ever is, or ever will be, right, is an expression of that same singular reality. And at the same time, that singular reality is never in any way diminished or divided in any way, shape, or form. So that's just a succinct, clear response. And in play, I hope that that also, adds one more component, that points to the Jewish roots of a non-dual orientation within the Jewish mystical tradition. And play, you're welcome to reach out to me too, because I've practiced as well in the Tibetan Kagyu lineage. So feel free to write me an email. I'm at Sam@Jewish Spirituality.
Yes, I already put your email.
Yeah, great.
Right in the chat. Okay, Sam, Rona has a question I think that she'd very much like to ask, which is, how is the desire for inner stillness different from a loss of ambition?
Yeah, oh, that's such a good question. The ego, the finite ego says, well, if I just become this knowing space without a personality, without an identity, without a name, without a form, right? Won't I lose all my ambition, right? Won't I lose any capacity to act and be in the world? That's a question the ego puts up as a kind of defense, right? Because the ego doesn't want to dissolve into nothingness, So first of all, I just want to say that when we begin to do these practices and we begin to have some kind of cognizance and awareness and recognition of our true nature, right, there may be a tendency to recoil, right? The ego mind, right, it might recoil, say, wait, oh, this is a little too groundless, maybe this practice isn't for me, and that's okay, that's natural, that's normal, right? What I want to affirm is that actually, in my experience, we don't need to get rid of the ego to rest in our true nature, right? Because the nature of true nature is that it's an embracing knowing space, right? And that every finite experience we have is arising in it. I want to invite you to check that out when you're walking down the street. You see trees, you see the sun, you see the sky, you see houses, you see people. Ask yourself, what are they arising in? Oh, they're arising in this knowing space, right? This like empty, infinite knowing space. So the ego can be included within that knowing space, and that includes all of the ego's ambitions and preferences, right? And what happens to the ego when we embrace it within this knowing infinite space is that it becomes less fixated, right, on its own survival, on its own ambitions, on its own goals, and begins to shift into a more altruistic kind of ego, right? And so I would say that our ambitions change. Instead of the ambition being, oh, I need to get comfortable, or oh, I need to avoid pain, or oh, I need to manipulate this and that person or this and that situation so that I don't have to experience fear or anxiety or difficulty or groundlessness. The ambition becomes, ooh, I really want to help people wake up to their true nature as an act of compassion so they can be liberated from their suffering, right? The ambition changes and there's less of an attachment to outcome. There's less of an attachment to outcome. So I'm going to do my work, right? And then I'm going to lean into the grace that is a direct outflow of true nature. There's a beautiful teaching of the Netivot Shalom, who was a Hasidic teacher in the 20th century. He said, Kodem hishtadlut v'achar kach matana, which means first we do our effort, right? We do our practice, we do our sadhana. First, we apply tremendous, strong effort, right, to cultivate ourselves and develop wisdom and compassion about, and a recognition of who we truly are. And then what happens next is an act of grace or a gift. So we need to find a balance between those two kind of impulses in practice. So don't worry, if you keep doing practices like this, your ambition won't disappear, but it will change. It will become refined. It will become altruistic and purified and of, kind of like self-centered clinging.
That might be a good place to end.
So yeah, we're over time.
Yeah, we're over time. We weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but the day was rich and beautiful. And thank you all for joining us. And just a reminder, there's no sit on Monday because it's a federal holiday in the United States. We'll see you on Tuesday, and wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom.
That was a joy.
People are still putting books in the chat.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good. Oh, and Jordan, thank you so much for holding the space so beautifully.